My motto is keep it simple. That's why I have such short scripture. But I'd like to reread it. To all at Sugar Creek who are loved by God and called to be saints, peace be with you. I read something in the Reader's Digest that was pretty interesting. This guy was applying for a job. And they said, "What's your strength?" And he said, "I can talk to animals." And the guy said, "Well, that's good. What's your weakness?" He said, "Well, they don't understand what I'm saying." I thought that fit. The other day I was talking to a friend and talking about situation in life, and another friend walked by and we said, "Hey, tell us a good word." He said, "I've said it all and nobody's listened." I thought that was interesting. And basically, to be honest with you, I felt the same way. I wasn't ever going to do this again because I'm beginning to believe, well, words aren't taken too serious because we find people who agree with us and then we listen and we don't hear anything new. But because I like Matt and Matt asked me to come, I said, sure. So here goes. And I hope it's half as listened to as they did your song. That was really good. The word politics. It's a divisive word. Now, if you want to keep the peace, if you want to keep your customers, if you want to enjoy a family dinner, don't talk politics. Now, I have no intentions to talk politics, so you can take a breath. But I do want to talk about a word that is close to it, and it's policy. I never thought much about policy, ever, until I was on the Parkview board. And when I got on the board, they handed me a big thick book and said, it might be a good idea to read this. These are the policies. Policies are simply standards to give you guidance. Now, they could be made into law, but not necessarily. They're to give you guidance. For an example, a good policy is credited with Ben Franklin when he said this: honesty is the best policy. And if you look that up on Google, it'll give you 11 good reasons to be honest. Jesus didn't give us law. In fact, he set us free from the law, but he did give us moral guidance. Policy to live by. Have you ever wondered why you think like you think? Why you have such strong opinions? Where did they come from? Have you ever stopped to think, what voices have helped you draw your conclusions? How much influence does a radio talk host have on you? How much does advertisement have on you? I still remember when I was a teenager, you only go around once in life, so grab all the gusto you can get. That was a beer advertisement. Some of the younger people maybe never heard it, but that was setting policy. Grab all the gusto you can get. And why do I remember that for 50 years? I don't know. The words you hear set your life's policies, who you choose to listen to, and the culture you grew up in influences your thinking. I was visiting with a couple of older ladies this summer, and we started to talk about the church and their youth group when they were young. And one of them said this: "It wasn't a very good time. You were told, just obey and don't ask any questions." Now, what kind of a policy is that? But they lived with it. That's their memory. So the question today is this: with all the noise, and there's lots of it, you got the liberals, you got the conservatives, you got the Democrats, you got the Republicans, you got the radio, you got the TV, you got Facebook, you got YouTube, you've got written literature. Now, how do you sort out good policy? Especially if you want to find people who agree with you. To answer this question for myself, all I can do is share with you how my Christian faith has helped me set my policy. No politician ever set policy for me. My Christian faith. When Paul writes to the Romans, he starts his letter by saying this: "You are called to be saints." How do I make good policy? Well, for me, I look at the saints who went before me. The saints who were full of grace. The saints who were full of compassion. The saints who took risks, who served others, who lived and loved fearlessly, who challenged injustice, who was faithful in loving their neighbor and themselves, and who were not identified by what they had, but by who they were, their character. These were the saints that influenced me. It wasn't the saints of 2,000 years ago. To be honest with you, they don't do me much good. They lived in different times, different cultures, but who's helped me are the modern day saints. People I've lived with, and especially my first 30 years. People who gave themselves. People who dreamed of healing the brokenhearted. Who would want to bring understanding. And they were great examples of what I thought Christ was. The saints I know did not quote theology. Their theories about God, and I had to agree with them and check all the lists. But what they did was show me compassion by the way they acted. And theology without good policy is the blind leading the blind. I just want to tell you about the saints that have made me who I am, who have affected my life. The first saint was simply my mother. I was extremely fortunate to have good parents. And her policy was simply this: serve others. No matter what color, who they are, how damaged they are, how wrong they are, serve others. When I was in the 8th grade, my mother had a niece who I barely knew. She lived 100 miles away. She had 3 girls, young, and she was pregnant. And her husband just left. My mother heard about this. Her niece's parents lived in Mount Pleasant, and he was a professor at Iowa Wesleyan. And my mother said to her niece, You have that baby, I'll take it. You live with your parents, you get your degree, and you take the baby back. I still remember the day the baby left. It was 2 years later. But what I remember is how often those 3 little girls and her niece would come to our place, play with us, play with her sister. And when my father died, this niece, 40 years later, 30 years later maybe, packed up those girls and brought them to the farm to say thank you. Then an instant replay, years later, another niece, 3 kids and pregnant, but this time this niece needed more boundaries. They put a mobile home in the yard to make sure those kids would have a chance. And I remember my mother said, we're going to have some fresh air kids. I want you to meet Black people from Chicago. I still remember their names. Aquila May Penn and Wanda Cobb. Don't know what happened to them, but I saw my first Black people. That was a wonderful policy. No politician set that for me. My mother did. Love your neighbor, serve, no matter who. Now, my second one, I've been blessed with good saints to recognize them, was my father-in-law and my mother-in-law. In 50 years, I never heard my father-in-law say a bad word about anybody. And after 30 years, I began to listen. Is this real? I'll surely catch him. But I never did. And his motto was this: if you can't say anything good, don't say it at all. That's a good policy. He was gentle. I walked into the room one day after my mother-in-law died, and he was reading the Mennonite, and he was reading about homosexuality. He said, what do you think about this? Which shocked me, because he wasn't one to deal with issues. I didn't know how to answer him, but he looked at me and said, I think these people need to be loved. And that was that. My mother practiced hospitality, and she once told me, I've had everybody in church for Sunday dinner. Now, where'd that policy go? I was in the National Guard when I married their daughter. Not one word of condemnation. I might have got it from other places, but not from them. Their policy was don't judge. Extremely fortunate to have saints like that in your life, to sort through. Now, the next one I never met, but I'm sure thankful for him. Governor Bob Ray. He was governor, 5-term Republican from 1968 to 1982. Now, some of you, well, a lot of you will remember him, but a lot of you would never, he might as well be a saint from 2,000 years ago. But I remember him. In 1975, he had a vision for Iowa. He wanted to start to resettle the refugees from the Vietnam War. Now, many leaders in his church, with the disciples of Christ, they were less than eager to get involved. They weren't sure they wanted to aid refugees. They might cost us, might steal our jobs. But Governor Ray said, they will work. He went to his church and he addressed them in the National Convention in St. Louis. And when he addressed his church, he said, don't tell me about your concerns. for these people, when you have a chance to save their lives, show me. Don't tell me you're a Christian. Show me. When people would say to him, you might not get reelected, he said, good, I can make more money if I'm not governor. We don't know our history. That was 50 years ago. I wonder what Governor Ray thinks of Iowa now. The saint that makes a difference in my life, that saint is because my church and the Methodist Church took one of those refugees. Iowa had been a light to the nation. 2 governors supported Governor Ray. That takes courage. Now, the reason he's a saint is my daughter married one of those refugees. If it hadn't been for Governor Ray, I wouldn't have my son-in-law, who is a great human being. And I wouldn't have my 2 grandsons, who are smart and wonderful kids. One man, courageous, going against the political and the religious system, saying, we have to do the right thing. The other saint is Martin Luther King. Here's what he said. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. People say times are bad. I hear it all the time. There's a lot of anxiety out there. In fact, there's a lot of fear. We have short memories and we're very poor at history. In the 60s, they were turbulent. Tells my age though. I got thinking that was 60 years ago. So it's fresh to me, but for a lot of you, you don't even know about the 60s. But the chaos was rampant. Major riots occurred in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, in 1964, New York City, in 1965, Watts, and in 1966, Chicago. Civil rights was rampant. And Christians justified it, saying the Egyptians had slaves. Some people say Martin Luther King was an agitator. But for me, he was a saint, instilling hope in a better America. Some people would think Jesus Christ himself is an agitator, but he was instilling hope for a better world. Words like this, I have a dream. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. What a wonderful, wonderful policy. And he says this, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And then he said, we have all come from different ships, but we must realize we're in the same boat now. Think about that. Sounds just like Jesus and modern day Jesus, stuff he might say. Martin Luther King did not put his light under a bushel, he let it shine. He said this, I have decided to stick with love. Hate is a great burden to bear. I went and visited the site where he was martyred, the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. I stood where James Earl Ray held his rifle, and it was somber. We killed the saint. The last one is this, we all know her, Mother Teresa. And her policy was this: be faithful in the small things, because it is in them your strength lies. And then she says, if you judge people, you have no time to love them. That's really good. And then she says, this coincides with John 3:17. Jesus said this: I have come into the world not to condemn it, but to save it. Jesus didn't have time for condemning anybody. He was in the business of trying to restore them. Another quote to think about is talking about the poor. Each one of them is Jesus in disguise. Do we really believe that? We sure shut the doors on Jesus. It rings true to Matthew 25:35-45 when Jesus said this: did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you visit the sick? Then you did it unto me. Jesus is not white and he isn't American. You need to think about that. Mother Teresa lived out Jesus' mission statement. And Jesus said this: I have come to heal the brokenhearted, give sight to the blind, set the captive free. She was light in a dark world. We're called to be just like her. So in closing, I just want to say this. A few weeks ago, I was driving down Highway 78, met a truck, and he threw a rock in my windshield. I have an insurance policy, but I didn't know what was in it. So I called my agent, and he told me. And I think sometimes when the world throws rocks at you and I, we simply should remember Jesus and ask him this: what's your policy say? And I think this is what he'd say: I have sent you saints, agents of mine, to show you and tell you what my policy is. Now pay attention to these saints. They will lead you into a life of service. They will teach you to love your neighbor like yourself. They will help you recognize your selfishness and your self-righteousness and your fear and your greed. And then they will ask you to turn on the light. Be an overcomer. Pay attention to these people. Don't cross them off as antagonists, people who rock the boat. But if you pay attention to them, you will have life and you will have it abundantly. I want to close with one statement. If you didn't get anything else, one statement, keep it simple. If your policy is to protect your space and your race, it's very narrow theology. Because God came to save all of humanity. Peace be with you.